Welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations, where we discuss theology, spirituality, ministry, and culture. Delighted to be joined today by Dr. Matthew Pinson, who is the president of Welch College. And today we are going to be discussing his new book, The Free Will Baptists, A New History, that is published with the University of Tennessee Press. Dr. Pinson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It's so good to be with you.
Yeah, excited about this new book. I wanted to start just really broadly. I know you're very interested. You're a student of history. I know you've studied, earned degrees in history, but specifically thinking about Free Will Baptist history, do you remember when you were kind of first interested or aware of cognitively interested in Free Will Baptist history?
Yes, I was 10 years old and we had CTS lessons at our church. And my father was the junior CTS teacher for the boys. And so there was a CTS literature called Junior Adventurer, and it was written by May Fry, whose husband Malcolm Fry was the head of CTS. That was before CTS and Sunday school came together in the National Association. And so May Fry and my dad introduced me to Paul Palmer and to Joseph Parker and Benjamin Randall and all these people in a series of lessons on Free Will Baptist history and doctrine. And that was when I was 10. I'd have been 9, 10, or 11, because that was the age group of the junior adventure. And so that's when I first got interested, and I was captivated. I found it very interesting. So I have to give it to May Fry and credit her for caring enough about our tradition to introduce it to 9, 10, and 11-year-olds. And so then I got in, I went through high school. I was captivated by my history professors in high school and my history teachers. And then I ended up studying history as one of the tiers in my bachelor's degree in humanities at University of West Florida. And when I was at Free Will Baptist Bible College in the mid 80s, I remember some lectures on Free Will Baptist history. I remember Jack Williams in particular giving a lecture at Free Will Baptist Bible College. And I can't remember what he talked about, but it was about Free Will Baptist history. And I can remember every time that I heard things mentioned at the college, that those old things that had been lodged in my mind by those lessons that my dad taught by May Fry came back. Anyway, so I eventually did a history minor kind of at University of West Florida. And then I did a master's in history, in American history at University of West Florida, and decided to write my thesis on the Northern Free Will Baptists and their religious social reform in the antebellum period before the war between the states. And so I got very interested in that, and actually got a grant from the Free Will Baptist Historical Commission, a study grant, and was able to go to the University of Mount Olive, to their Free Will Baptist historical collection there. I was able to go to the American Baptist Historical Society when it was still housed at Colgate Rochester Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York. I was also able to go to Bates College in Maine, which was the Northern Free Will Baptist College up there. And so that was kind of my start. I think my real start in wanting to research this stuff on a deeper level was when I went to the historical collection at Mount Olive. And I had done a lot of work in the Randall movement, but I really hadn't done much in the Southern movement, which of course was my own heritage. And so when I went up on that research tour with that grant from the Historical Commission, I got an opportunity to meet Dr. Michael Pelt and Mr. Gary Fenton Barefoot. Dr. Pelt was the head of the religion department at Mount Olive, and his family, he had known my grandfather and all, so they were from West Florida, so I already knew the Pelts, and I stayed in his home. He took me to the collection. He introduced me to Mr. Barefoot, who was the curator of the collection and also the head of the library over there. And so they opened up this world of Southern Free Will Baptist history to me that I have fallen in love with. And so that's a little bit about my beginnings as a Free Will Baptist historian, rather than just kind of a general church historian and theologian.
Yeah. When I was a student at Welch College, I enjoyed having a Free Will Baptist history class with you. And I think that played a big role in my interest in Free Will Baptist and General Baptist history. But in that class, we read, I think, your Free Will Baptist Handbook, which is a history of Free Will Baptism, along with some documents. But you also had us read William Davidson's History of the Free Will Baptists and Michael Pelt's History of the Free Will Baptists. So, thinking about those surveys of Free Will Baptist history, what would you say are maybe some of the differences between this new book that you've come out with and Davidson and Pelt?
Yeah, before Bill Davidson, we had two surveys of Free Will Baptist history in the 20th century. One was by George Washington Millian, that great Arkansas preacher and county judge, that was such an erudite, sort of lay level volume about Free Will Baptist history. And then my dear friend Damon Dodd wrote a book called The Free Will Baptist Story. And he was originally from Southwest Missouri, but spent most of his ministry in Georgia and was kind of an expert on Georgia Free Will Baptist history. But those were those were not scholarly histories, that they were very fine and enjoyable to read, but they were kind of spotty, because we just didn't have a lot of archival, resources back then. And so it really took Bill Davidson to break into kind of scholarly archival research and history of our movement that sort of adheres to your standard historiographical norms. And so Bill Davidson kind of started all that. And he wrote his dissertation on the Palmer movement in the early years in the 18th century down in North Carolina, and just really ushered us into an amazing field of inquiry, and there's still so much to be done. So you have Davidson, and of course you have George Stevenson, who never really wrote anything. I mean, he's got a lot of papers in the Mount Olive, in the University of Mount Olive Free Baptist Historical Collection. And he wrote a few dictionary entries I can't remember if it's called the Dictionary of North Carolina Biography or the Encyclopedia of North Carolina Biography, but a few very nice articles or entries in that dictionary. And these are like lengthy. It's not like a little dictionary. It's a historical dictionary or a historical encyclopedia. So these are lengthy articles that are, probably 2-column pages and maybe 3 or 4 pages on each one. But Stevenson was the archivist, was one of the senior archivists for the state of North Carolina for decades, and he was a Free Will Baptist layman. And he basically he discovered a whole lot about early, like late 17th and early 18th century origins of the Free Will Baptists in North Carolina. And Bill Davidson worked with a lot of Stevenson's material, and then did a lot of original research of his own, and and then ended up moving on from that dissertation at New Orleans Seminary to researching the whole of the movement and produced really the first scholarly history of the denomination. And then you got Michael Pelt, who comes along and writes a history of the original Free Will Baptists, which is that group that we had a schism with back in 1962, primarily over church government, but I go into detail on that in the book. And by the way, let me just tell you, I had Gary Barefoot went to, when Dr. Pelt was still alive, Gary Barefoot went and read it to him in the assisted living home.
Wow.
And so he gave me, Dr. Pelt gave me, and then Gary Barefoot both gave me 2 thumbs up on that. And I had Daryl Holly and Dr. Pickerly read it, and they both gave me 2 thumbs up.
Okay.
So, I mean, if Michael Pelt can give you 2 thumbs up on the section on the schism in 1962, and Dr. Pickerly can give you 2 thumbs up, then I thought,
Yeah.
I kind of fulfilled my goal of writing an objective history that both sides would say, yeah, that's kind of what happened. And so, but anyway, so Dr. Pelt's book is largely a history of the whole movement, because it deals with the whole movement up until 1962, when you have this split where the Convention of Original Free Will Baptists leaves the National Association over church government and some other issues, and then they start new. And then the rest of his book is about that movement. But his book is sort of written from the obvious vantage point of someone who is in that movement. But it's a very good book, and like you say, I had y'all read that, and I've had everybody in my classes read that for 20 years. So I think the major difference between my book and their book is that I have the luxury of doing interpretation and doing intellectual history, which, for us is largely theological history. And I have the luxury of doing that because I'm not having to go and prove all this stuff. So there were all these things from tradition that were repeated by lay historians over the centuries, but that were never proven, archivally or historiographically. And so what Davidson especially, and to some degree Pelt, were doing was proving a lot of things. There are just a lot of questions that lay historians that still kind of hang in the air. Like I'm just amazed at how many questions I get about, well, are Free Will Baptists really related to the English General Baptists? Were the General Baptists that Paul Palmer was a part of, were they English General Baptists? Of course, I kind of joke and say, well, they had to have been English because there wasn't an America. They had to have been English, and there were only 2 kinds of Baptists. I mean, other than a few Seventh-day Baptists, you had General Baptists and Particular Baptists. Yeah. So if they weren't 5-point Calvinists, they were General Baptists, and they were English, because in America in 1727, everybody was English. And so, but still, there are a lot of people who say, well, isn't Benjamin Randall the founding father of the denomination? Isn't the main history of our denomination Benjamin Randall? And of course, that's a part of our heritage, but it's a small part. There's still so much to be done and so much to learn about Free Will Baptist history and about our tradition, that other than, Benjamin Randall, as important as he was to a portion of our denomination and to our whole story. But there are a lot of questions that still hang around in sort of lay historians. Is the movement of Paul Palmer, I mean, are the 19th century North Carolina Free Will Baptists related to Paul Palmer, or is it just a brand new, So there are all these questions that are still hanging around. And what I a lot of times want to say when I get these questions is, have you read Bill Davidson's book? It's like Bill Davidson goes into great detail proving that Paul Palmer was an English General Baptist, and that these people were using the 1660 Standard Confession from London,
Mm.
and that these people were writing to their brethren over in England and all this kind of stuff. And so, I don't have to redo all that.
Yeah.
So I just hope that when I put in the footnote, like I have one long footnote about the question of the English General Baptist background of the American Free Will Baptist movement, and I basically just summarize everything that Bill Davidson spends 50 pages documenting and proving. And so I don't have to do that. I have the luxury of not having to go into this great detail to prove point by point by point with evidence that
Mm.
these things are so. And that, we don't all just go back to Benjamin Randall in 1780 in New England. And we do go back to England. And the 1812 abstract that was the most the most widely used confession in Southern Free Will Baptist history was basically a condensed version of the 1660 Standard Confession from London, from the General Baptist. And so I don't have to retrace all those steps. Davidson's done it for us, and Pelt has done a lot of that as well. For example, Pelt has this great statement that he makes that the Staffordshire General Baptists was the group that the Perquimans precinct congregation that Benjamin Laker left behind him in 1702. They sent a letter to the English General Baptist, and it was the Staffordshire group that they sent that letter to, which was one of those very creedal groups of General Baptists that had come out of the General Assembly. And that will be in the book that you and I are writing,
Mhm.
that's going to come out hopefully next year with B&H Academic on the English General Baptists. And so all this stuff has been researched heavily by Davidson, by Stevenson even, and of course Pelt. And so there's a lot of things I just don't have to do. So I've got the luxury of doing interpretation
Yeah.
and setting them more in their broader context of American religious history. And I've also got the luxury of doing more intellectual history. So I do a lot more with the theology of these people, both in the North and with the Randall movement in the 19th century, as well as the Southern movement. And that's one of the things that is new about this book, is the theological history of our movement that we don't really have in published form. There are a few pamphlets that the Historical Commission has put out that deal with some of this, but largely that kind of theological spade work is kind of new to the field. That would be the main differences between what I'm doing and what. And by the way, let me say something. Dr. Piccirilli is the other big person here. Dr. Piccirilli has tended to write what historians call microhistory. He's tended to go deep and to look at small historical portraits that kind of give shape to the larger story or the larger narrative. And so we owe so much to Dr. Robert Piccirilli, and in addition to Davidson and Pelt. And I would recommend he's got a book called Little Known Chapters in Free Will Baptist History, and then he's got another book called Free Will Baptist History. And his chapters in those books are these micro histories that go into detail on these specific small questions about Free Will Baptist history that is so informative and really helped me so much. So even though he didn't write a survey, he has really shaped the discipline of Free Will Baptist history in profound ways. So for that reason, I included him. I dedicated this book to Bill Davidson, to William F. Davidson, Michael R. Pelt, and Robert E. Piccirilli. Those were the three dedicatees of this volume. And I owe so much. And I said it in the dedication, and I stand on their shoulders, because I really do. It's just they have provided me with the luxury to be able to do this kind of interpretive, intellectual kind of history.
Mm. And I love the way that you describe that as a luxury in the sense of building on the research that they've done before, which enables you to maybe explore some other areas. One of the luxuries that we have as historians in the 21st century are all of these archives and databases that are available to us online. So it's possible for us to find things in archives via these online databases that maybe previous historians wouldn't have had access to unless they had traveled to other places. So I'm wondering, since your history is new and has been written within the last few years, maybe because of access to other databases or having those luxuries of not having to do all of that original research, were there some things that you uncovered that hadn't been uncovered in previous histories?
Well, that's a very good question. And let me say that there's this burgeoning field that you've referenced here known as the digital humanities. And it's basically using all these online databases and all this material that has been put online to do research when before you'd have had to, gone overseas. In the case of the stuff you and I've been working on English General Baptist history, or you'd have to go up to New England or drive, up to Michigan or over to North Carolina or down to Georgia. Now, a lot of this stuff is increasingly online. Eric Thompson, with the Free Will Baptist Historical Commission, has done so much for us in putting a lot of the information from the Free Will Baptist Historical Collection. And by the way, one of our own Welch guys, Philip Morgan, is the curator of that collection. Does a fantastic job. History teacher at Welch, Philip Morgan. But Eric Thompson has basically taken a lot of what we have, especially minutes, in the Free Will Baptist Historical Collection at Welch College, which is basically the collection of the Historical Commission of the National Association of Free Will Baptists. And Mr. Thompson has taken that and put it and digitized it, and it's all online. And you can go on fwbhistory.com and look at all these minutes, National Association, State Association, and local conferences and associations. And you can look at old hymnals, you can look at old books, papers, letters, and it's just fascinating and fabulous. And I don't know what I could have written this book. I mean, I could have written it, but it would have been a whole lot harder.
Yeah.
Without the work that's been done on fwbhistory.com and the digitization that's been done. But also another source was ancestry.com. Ancestry.com.
I think
one of the things
that's
that makes
probably
this
pretty
book,
that's probably pretty weird for people to hear. So I'm looking forward to your explanation of this because I think most people are not going to haven't thought of ancestry.com for the sort of thing that you've done.
yeah, I mean, ancestry.com is basically a storehouse, a growing storehouse of information about dead people, about our ancestors. And so you've got, all these court records, all these land deeds, military records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates. So, there are all these people that I have now, without having to go to North Carolina or South Carolina or Alabama or Mississippi to do archival research on a particular person, I can find that person's birth certificate, death certificate, that they served in the Civil War. That they there was a time when there was a marriage certificate that had their name on it because they married someone in Columbus, Mississippi, or whatever. And so ancestry.com has been a huge resource, because one of the biggest problems we have in Free Will Baptist history is proving where most of the Southern movement has come from. A lot of people have assumed that these groups in Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Arkansas, and the like just kind of sprung up spontaneously, because we know that a lot of these people came from United Baptist and separate Baptist backgrounds, which is kind of like what now has become the Southern Baptists.
Yeah.
Uh, and some of them came from regular Baptist, 5-point Calvinist regular Baptist backgrounds. And so I think some people have just assumed, well, I know some people have just assumed that all these groups in these different parts of the country that came from regular Baptist or separate Baptist or United Baptist backgrounds just sprung up because people were reading their Bible and they saw Arminianism, and so what I began to say was, and yet the published historians have always said these groups surely were influenced by people from the Palmer movement,
Yeah.
from the Carolinas. All the published work, all the way back to G.W. Million and G.A. Barrett back in the early 20th century, through G.W. Million in the 1950s, Damon Dodd, Dr. Davidson, Dr. Pelt, Dr. Piccirilli, all the published authors have always, assumed that Palmer was the background for the Palmer movement in the Carolinas, was the background for the rest of the Southern Free Will Baptists, and why they left their Calvinist or mildly Calvinist backgrounds and became Free Will Baptist. But we just haven't proven it. And so that's really what Ancestry.com helped me do, because I was able to look at birth certificates and death certificates and newspaper clippings and marriage certificates and land deeds and find out where these people went, where they came from.
Mm.
And so there's still so much work to be done. Newspapers.com is another resource that I think we will, Philip Morgan has done a lot with newspapers.com, and I think we're going to find a lot out from that, because newspapers are beginning, small town Southern newspapers are beginning to be digitized in large numbers and go all the way back to the 19th century. And that's something I didn't have access to, and I didn't have there were a lot of the small towns that didn't have it to where I could look at it. So that's the next big frontier for Free Will Baptist history in the United States, and that is newspapers.com. But anyway, archive.org helped me look into this question of what I call frontier migration patterns. You have this huge number of North Carolinians and South Carolinians that left between 1800 and 1860 and went largely to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky and Tennessee. And so, a portion of those were Free Will Baptists. And so the spontaneous origins theory that a lot of people have just didn't seem to make sense to me, because where did they go? I used to joke with my classes, you probably heard this when you were a student, were they eaten up by black bears when they went across the Smokies? I mean, what happened to all the Free Will Baptists who migrated from the Carolinas in the antebellum period before the Civil War? And so I began to look at them to see where they went. And so that's a big part of what this book is. It's showing how that we know, for example, Georgia Free Will Baptists, Alabama Free Will Baptists, Florida Free Will Baptists, we because of what I've been able to find out through genealogical resources, we kind of know that those were North Carolina people or South Carolina people who moved to those areas. And and some of it, of course, is circumstantial evidence. Like, for example, there's a guy named Matthew Spivey, whose father, Caleb Spivey, was a General Baptist pastor, a Free Will Baptist pastor in the 1830s in North Carolina. And Matthew Spivey moves to southeast Georgia. And it just so happens that in the next 10 years, you have an association in southeast Georgia, a lot of whom are former United Baptists. and they just so happened to use the 1812 abstract from the Carolinas, which
Seems
is
pretty
based on the
coincidental.
1660 General Baptist Confession in England. So, it's just like, yeah, that's circumstantial, but I kind of bet they came from
Yeah.
old brother Spivey.
Yeah, seems like a good chance of that.
So yeah,
Um,
ancestry.com has been a huge, and of course there are other ancestry and genealogical sources that are also good that I used, but you can't afford but so many subscriptions to these
yeah.
digital sites.
Yeah. So
But I got to
Ans
tell you, archive.org is becoming an amazing resource.
mm,
And I've even noticed just with you and I writing this General Baptist book, the number of 17th century sources that are starting to be put on archive.org. It's amazing.
yeah, one of the things that you and I both encountered some recently is a scan of Thomas Helwys' work on archive.org that
Yeah.
includes some material maybe that hadn't been in some previous scans. So that is interesting. So you deal a lot with the Palmer movement, and that's particularly helpful for Free Will Baptist history, especially in the South, and thinking about your own origins and your family as well. Um, I remember when I was a student at Welch College, hearing Jack Williams give a presentation on the Northern Free Will Baptist movement, the Randall movement. And the presentation was something on the day we lost 10,000 churches or something like that. But what he was ultimately talking about was how the
Well,
Randall
it wasn't 10,000, but
how the what he's ultimately I'm pretty I don't
yeah.
remember what the number was, but
Yeah.
it was thousands. But what he's talking about is how the Randall movement eventually merged with the Northern Baptist Convention in the early 20th century. Um, and so you discussed that a little bit, but can you talk a little bit about the Randall movement and how really kind of all but maybe a tiny minority of those ended up merging with the Northern Baptist Convention, and only a tiny minority kind of remained Free Will Baptist?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I've had there's some people that think we don't need to study the Randall movement, and because they provide only a small portion of the heritage of modern day Free Will Baptists. But I'm kind of thinking not so fast. We need to understand that movement
Mm,
because it has an impact on the modern movement, not just through the the churches like in Southern Ohio and some in Missouri, um, and some in West Virginia and Kentucky, even that come out that really do have Randall heritage, Randall, a Randall tradition. Uh, they can trace themselves all the way back. And so, obviously, for them, even though it constitutes a small minority of modern day Free Will Baptists, most of whom are coming from the Palmer movement. But in addition to that, the 1911 merger just had a big impact on the psyche of the Free Will Baptist denomination.
mm,
And for example, even though they were in a different movement, for example, there are people in Ohio who actually were tied with the Thomas Peden movement that came out of the Randall movement in the 1880s. Thomas Peden, who was from the Randall movement, actually became principal for a while of Aden Seminary in North Carolina. And so, and then the Southern Ohio group was in the original General Conference, which was dominated by people on the Eastern Seaboard in the 1920s. And so this 1911 merger with the Northern Baptists was fresh on everybody's minds. And you would have people that would stand up and make resolutions back during the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the General Conference. And they would say, we need to be very careful not to let what happened to the Northern Free Will Baptists happen to us. And so I don't think we need to ignore the Randall movement. I think that there's a lot of Free Will Baptist history that gives too much emphasis to the Randall movement.
Mm,
It's almost like the Randall movement is the Free Will Baptist movement. That is the history of Free Will Baptists. Well, it's not. It's just a small portion of the history of modern day Free Will Baptists. I think part of the reason why people tend to give way too much emphasis to the Randall movement in proportion to their actual ratio of our modern day Free Will Baptist history is because they just were a wealthier movement, and therefore they just had more output. There were just more hardback books.
mm,
That, most of the things that were printed in the South uh, were ephemeral booklets, except for the hymnals. Most everything was a booklet. We didn't have staples in the 19th century, and they would tie it with thread. And it was a booklet, like you'd see a stapled booklet today, but rather than metal staples, it was tied together with fabric, and which meant that it was even less stable than a staple. And so most of these books went out of existence. That's why we don't have a lot of minutes and books and booklets and pamphlets for the Southern Free Will Baptist movement. A lot of them they're all gone. They only printed, 400 copies or something
mm.
uh, of a pamphlet, and it's gone. And so we know it existed, but there are a lot of them we probably don't even know that they existed, and they're out of existence. But the Randall movement in the North, I mean, they were well educated and they had full-time pastorates that all you did was pastor, and you had a college degree or a master's degree, and you were in a cushy, parsonage in a New England town, and you had this church of this beautiful architecture and down in downtown, and you had all these hardback books, and you had these hardback journals that were being published every quarter, and the Free Will Baptists were in the North were more wealthy than the other Baptists. And so it was a different thing. And so like you can go up in New England and Ohio and Michigan and just go to a used bookstore and just find all this stuff from the Randall movement. And I think that has caused people to think, well, that's our history. That's the history of the Free Will Baptists, and to kind of ignore the Southern movement. And so I'm kind of in the middle here, saying to the guys and gals that are really pro Palmer, and they're just going to say, let's just ignore the Randall movement. I'm saying, no, not so fast. We don't need to ignore the Randall movement. We need to pay attention to it. And then I'm telling the people over here that are saying, well, Palmer? I've never heard that word. What are you talking about? I'm saying to them, well, we need to stop putting all the emphasis on the Randall movement, most of which went out of existence in 1911, and start looking more at the broader picture. But I think it's a both and thing. And there's a lot of theological history that I've done with the Randall movement that I think people are going to find is original and very, very fascinating. One of the things that most people are going to probably be surprised by is how liberal the Randall movement got in the late 19th and early 20th century. I go into detail on that. And I think that's one of the reasons why they had the merger.
Yeah.
If you're having questions about whether there was a Moses, and if there was a Moses, he didn't write the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, well, then you're probably not going to be sitting here worried about, whether or not you can lose your salvation. And so, Calvinism and Arminianism are the least of your worries when you're wondering how many Isaiahs were there. Was there 2 or 3 authors of the book of Isaiah? Things of that nature. Did Jesus really walk on the water? And so you have people that, the Randall. Some people will be surprised at how many people there were in the Randall movement who went to Germany for their PhD and who came back very liberal, and who taught in their seminaries and their colleges, and that the Randall movement became very liberal theologically, and and in every other way, very wed to the social gospel and to the ecumenical movement of the early 20th century. And so the Randall movement as a whole was really on the modernist side of what we call the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And the people who stayed out of the merger, one could almost see those little Free Will Baptists down in Texas and Missouri and Ohio that stayed out of the merger and were going to remain Free Will Baptist as kind of the fundamentalist side in the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And so, actually, there's a paper you wrote at Southern Seminary on this very topic that I utilize in this book.
Mm.
That they'll see some references to your work. You did a lot of spade work on this question that I really benefited from as well. So, that's going to be an important thing. And then there's a lot of theological stuff even before they kind of began to go down. But I also think that there are some lessons we can learn from the Randall movement. They became very enamored with other groups, very enamored with keeping up with the Joneses and being cool with, the Methodists and the Congregationalists and the Baptists and the big churches downtown.
Mhm.
And they were just very concerned about that. And I think that they allowed respectability and concern for uh, keeping up with the big boys in the other denominations to basically get them unconcerned about their own theology
Yeah.
and what made them Free Will Baptists. And so by the time it was all said and done, they weren't really Free Will Baptists. They went for several years and even decades not preaching things that they were in their treatise, but they didn't, they just stopped preaching them. Even if they still kind of believed them, they stopped preaching them because they wanted to get members from these other denominations and all. And pretty soon, nobody in their churches knew that they were Free Baptist. That's the name that they took on in the late 19th century. None of the people in their churches knew they were Free Baptists anyway. They had kind of stopped believing it and just kind of went away. And I think that's a morality tale for us, Jesse. I think we need to think about that in our movement. Do we want our movement to survive? Do we think that we have something to offer the Church of Jesus Christ and the world? And if we do, if we cover it up and obscure it, i.e., our Arminianism, our ecclesiological distinctives, our Church of Doctrine of the Church distinctives, then I think the same thing that happened to the Randall movement could happen to us.
Well, I think that really leads into a final question I want to ask you. And that is, over the past, I don't know, a few decades or so, certainly in the last decade or two, there's been a lot of discussion about historical and theological retrieval, especially among Protestant evangelicals. And I'm just wondering, with your studies, the research you've done over the years, but even for this book, thinking about Free Will Baptist and Free Will Baptist history, what are some things that we should retrieve from our Free Will Baptist forebears?
Yeah. Well, you know, what, let me start off with things that we should not retrieve. And it builds on what I was saying a moment ago about the liberalism and the Randall movement and the theological ambiguity that became the norm in the Randall movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But let me just say this. There's something we need to not to retrieve from our past, and that is our past in the Free Will Baptist Church is a chronicle, a narrative of becoming fascinated with other theological groups and wanting their approval and being intimidated by them and being intimidated by their success and wanting success ourselves. And we have tended to react to that in one of three ways. Either we have become very narrow and very withdrawalist and very Christ against culture and very ignorant and not interested in education, not interested in theology. And the way to protect ourselves is just to withdraw into our little shells. Or we have become what I call wannabes. We want to be a Free Will Baptist version of the Methodists, a Free Will Baptist version of the Presbyterians, a Free Will Baptist version of the Pentecostal holiness, a Free Will Baptist version of the, and now it's kind of like we want to be a Free Will Baptist version of the Southern Baptists or of the Independent Baptists or of the non-denominational megachurch. That's our big things now. Of course, with the Gen Z, like you say, with the emphasis on retrieval, some of the Gen Z want to be a Free Will Baptist version of the Anglicans. But I think sometimes when you're so concerned about wanting to be a Free Will Baptist version of something more successful, that in your human terms seems more successful to you, or what I tell the students in my class is whoever your big boys on the playground are, who you're kind of intimidated by and you kind of want to be in good with, who you think's cool. And you might think that the Anglicans and the liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer is cool, or you might think the latest, non-denominational megachurch is cool. Who's your big boy on the playground? Who do you think is cool?
Yeah.
And I really think that is the lesson we have to learn from our past, going all the way back to the mid 1700s when the Calvinists seemed so cool, and they ended up just kind of taking over the vast majority of the North Carolina Free Will Baptist movement, which at that time was called General Baptist. But you have it with the Campbell movement, the Church of Christ and the Christian Church and Disciples of Christ movement in the mid 19th century. And then, of course, you have it with the merger of the Northern Free Will Baptists. You have a little Pentecostal problem in the 1920s. And so when Free Will Baptists are at their best is when they pursue a third option, not this obscurantist kind of anti-culture, anti-intellectual, anti-theological withdrawalism, and not this kind of how can I be successful and be as much like the cool people I think are cool in the evangelical community. But how can we be ourselves and draw from the rich tradition that we have that goes all the way back to the English General Baptist, all the way back to the Protestant Reformation, and to the Church Catholic, the universal church, small c Catholic. How can we retrieve that and be the best we can be and not have to always be wannabes and be intimidated and sort of have this inferiority complex that we sometimes have because we're a small, distinctive denomination and we're not some of the big boys. And so I think that's what we can learn, but that's something that you don't want to, it's a negative thing. It's a negative morality tale. But as far as what we can retrieve, I think is when we were at our best, when we were learning and teaching and evangelizing and doing missions, and when we were excited about who we were because we believed that we were teaching the doctrine that was found in Holy Scripture and the doctrine of the New Testament, of the apostles and of Christ. And we really believed that, and we believed that the distinctive faith and practice of the Free Will Baptist was really true. We really believed it, and when we would bump into it in the New Testament as we were preaching, we would actually talk about it. We would say, "Oh, yeah, that's what it says here," and this doesn't teach, once saved, always saved, or this actually teaches a conditional predestination, or whatever it is. And I think that that's when we've been at our best, and that's something that we have to retrieve. When Free Will Baptists were at their best, when they and I don't mean this in a negative sense of pride, but when they took pride in who they were and in the rich tradition that they had, and they were were proud of it, and they weren't ashamed of it, and they weren't trying to just keep up with the Joneses in the bigger groups. And because when Free Will Baptists do that, they are always more successful at evangelism and mission and discipleship and having strength that's sustainable over generations that doesn't just sputter out. When they get into kind of this kind of let's try to emulate other groups and try to downplay our own identity, that's never sustainable. It never actually results in sustainable growth. It kind of, there's like this boom time, and then it kind of peters out, and it doesn't really amount to anything. And what's worse, they usually lose a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I think that Reformed Arminianism is obviously a big thing that we need to retrieve, but I think our polity, uh, I think Free Will Baptists are in danger of becoming independent Baptists and non-denominational megachurch people who maybe have kind of a pastors gathering of that kind of comes together once a year or twice a year with some other churches in the area, and it's mainly pastors, and you kind of come together and have some food and then leave. And that's what worries me the most. I think our distinctive polity, which is a strong intercongregational polity that maintains ordination of pastors and even deacons, and that has a strong polity, but still maintains the self-governance of each local congregation. I think that's the answer to a lot of the issues we're facing in our denominational challenges and churches not having the resources to continue after their pastor resigns and they don't have a pastor for a while. There's just not that strength and that network and that training. And another thing we're missing that I think we could retrieve from, 75, 100, 150 years ago is the emphasis on the laity. Laity were strong in our denomination. Lay leaders, men and women in congregations, were strong, and they were strong at the conference and association level, and they were strong at the state association level and the national association level, and they were trained, and they understood their Bible, and they knew doctrine, and they could teach a lesson, they could preach a sermon if they were called on to do that when the pastor was away. And so you had laymen who could handle things when the pastor resigned, and could hold the church together. And we don't have as much of that anymore because we've tended to get into this kind of staff-led, pastor-led model of the late 20th century, which kind of disempowers the laity. The laity are just receiving. They're not giving. They're not involved. They're not, the Bible says we're all able ministers of the new covenant. And we're kind of devoicing the laity and disempowering them and taking away their role as being able ministers of the new covenant. And in the end, that means that our churches are not sustainable. We have to deal with an elite, trained clergy. We have to keep that we have to depend on that to do anything. And we have spent a lot of time, like Welch College was in the business of training clergy, training ministers, because we knew that we had to have more of those or we weren't going to make it. And so I think we kind of got our eggs so much in the basket of trained clergy that it's almost like the laity, they're not trained, they're not involved, they don't go to the association meetings because they're not invited by the pastors to go. And so I think that part of that strong intercongregational polity that offered accountability and a support network and system for smaller churches, that also placed a great deal of emphasis on the empowerment of the laity and the leadership of the laity. And we can really stand to retrieve that. I think another thing we can retrieve is our rituals. We put a lot more emphasis on what they often called the sacraments back in those days. And, the Lord's Supper was an important moment for our Free Will Baptist congregations. It was a hallowed, important moment that you even fasted to get ready for and you prepared for, and it was a big deal. The washing of the saints' feet was taught and protected and preached about, and you prepared for it a week in advance, and you had a week of prayer, and all this kind of stuff. And we have gotten to the place where those, what scholars call the ritual life of the Baptist communities, have kind of gone by the wayside. We need to retrieve the anointing of the sick. All of our churches anointed the sick, and that's something that's almost kind of fallen out of favor in a lot of our congregations. And I want to say that's a wonderful biblical practice that was universally practiced amongst Free Will Baptists. And we need to retrieve the anointing of the sick and believe that God can heal people in His sovereign will. And so that the washing of the saints' feet, the anointing of the sick, things like that, the Lord's Supper being a serious ordinance or sacrament that is very important to the life of the church. Those are things that I think we can retrieve. And also a sense that even though we're not sitting here worried about the people who happen to be succeeding at the moment who have different doctrine than we have, and thereby downplaying our doctrine, I do think there was more of a sense that we are a part of the Protestant movement. And by being a part of the Protestant Reformation, we are a part of the larger church, the small c Catholic, the church Catholic, the universal church. And our ancestors would say the Roman Catholics are not the true Catholics. The people that are engaged in real Catholicity are the Baptists. They're the ones who have recovered the true one holy Catholic Church that has continued since the apostles. And so I think that when we were at our best, we had this wonderful ecumenical relationship with other Christians and with the Christian tradition. And the reason we were so winsome and so ecumenical and so positive about that was because we did not have an inferiority complex about our Arminianism or our church polity, which was different from a lot of the others, especially the Baptists. We were kind of we were not independent enough for the Baptists. We were not connectional enough for the Methodists. We were just kind of in no man's land. We obviously were in no man's land on our doctrine of salvation because we were not Wesleyan enough for the Wesleyans. We were too Calvinist for the Wesleyans and too Arminian for the Baptists. So, but when we had confidence in our identity and our theology, and we could just kind of unselfconsciously, winsomely, not beat people over the head with it, but just preach what we thought the Bible taught on Sunday. And when we came to it, we preached it and we trained people in it. We trained our Sunday school teachers how to, what Free Will Baptist theology was. That's when we were at our best, but not when we withdrew and when we only hung out with people like us. It was when we were confident in who we were, but we wanted to have friendships and we wanted to be part of the larger church. And when we were proud of being Protestant and proud of the Christian tradition and our place in it, that's something that we can retrieve from our past. So there's hey boy, this question I could go on and on for an hour.
This could be a
this retrieval
series.
question, but that would be the low-hanging fruit there of retrieval from our tradition.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think there's a great deal that we can learn and a great deal that we can retrieve. So I appreciate you sharing those things. Well, let me encourage our viewers to pick up a copy of The Free Will Baptist, A New History by J. Matthew Pinson, published by the University of Tennessee Press. And let me say, Dr. Pinson, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Dr. Owens. This has been such a pleasure, and I appreciate you so much.
Yeah, thank you.